Okay, we are going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's presentation on impacts of drought in Nebraska. My name is Kristen Jansen, and I am an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before tonight's speakers, there are a few housekeeping things to go over. Your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. So please type any questions that you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll answer those at some point during or after the presentation. This presentation will be recorded and will be uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page within the next couple of weeks. So if you miss any part of today's presentation, would like to revisit any part, or to share with others, you will be able to find it there. Following the presentation, we will just have a brief survey that should take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. And if anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska, or to find out more about what we do, I will put our email in the chat. Feel free to reach out. So tonight we welcome Kelly Smith from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Ben Beckman from the Nebraska Extension Office, who are going to speak to us about the impacts of drought in Nebraska. So I will let them take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Kristen. I will go ahead and share my screen if that's okay. So you're seeing the screen now, correct?
Yep.
My name is Kelly Smith. I am the Assistant Director at the National Drought Mitigation Center, which is based at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I will provide a very brief overview of our organization, and then I will talk more about drought impacts specifically. That how we know how drought is affecting us is actually my area of research. And it's sometimes harder than you think, especially because some of the impacts are not as obvious as others. So the official mission of the Drought Center is to reduce the effects of drought on people, the environment, and the economy through good science, and also teaching people how to apply that for good planning. And I will give you a very quick, a 90-second overview of what we mean by drought planning. And we do work with decision makers at all scales, from homeowners and individual farmers and ranchers all the way up to countries around the world. One of the questions that comes up a lot is how we're funded. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has been our most consistent funding partner. We actually were started with an earmark through USDA, and we still have always worked with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We've also always done a lot of international work. About a third of our work is with different United Nations organizations. And we also have had a lot of grants and contracts with NOAA, the people that do the weather service and the National Integrated Drought Information System. So this is kind of the underlying concept of the Drought Center. We were founded by Dr. Don Wilhite back in 1995, who he was an agricultural meteorologist, or in an agricultural meteorology department. He was a climatologist, and he had this kind of insight that people kept treating drought like something they couldn't possibly have anticipated, and every drought was its own separate crisis. So our goal is to get people to recognize ahead of time that, oh, we could probably do some things to reduce the effects of the next drought. So the hydrological cycle kind of illustrates this idea. It starts maybe around 3 o'clock, where 4 o'clock on the circle, where somebody is just very happily enjoying nice weather. But, too many nice days in a row without rain is what you call a drought. So here he is, not noticing things are getting dry. He's about to bump into a tree stump. He literally has an impact. And at that point, he becomes aware there's a problem. But there also are not very many options by the time you're actually aware of drought. It's a slow-moving hazard. So then panic sets in, and then finally it starts to rain, and then people forget all about it. So and the cycle goes on. But our desire is to intervene right here around the 2 o'clock position on the circle to get people to think, what could we have done differently, or what can we do differently before the next one? So that's kind of the mission of the Drought Center in a more fun way. We started out with about half a dozen employees. I was one of them back in 1995. We now have about 20 or 30 people on staff with a wide variety of expertise. There's kind of a core expertise in climatology and geography, but we've also got history, journalism, social scientists, quite the spread of skills that it takes. Our website, drought.unl.edu, is people have said it's like an online textbook for drought planning. And we actually take that as a compliment. It's quite thorough. You can learn a lot there, access a whole lot of different resources. We have a very spun up, consistent communications program. You can subscribe at this link, at this QR code, or by going to our website. We have annual and quarterly publications. We have monthly assessments of drought and how drought is affecting the country. We also have several tweets that we do each week around the U.S. Drought Monitor, which comes out every Thursday morning. So it's a very consistent communications routine. All right, that's it for the overview of the Drought Center, and I will now give you the very quick overview of drought planning. I like to kind of break it down into three main questions. And that's, what do you want to protect? How will you know that you're in a drought? And what can you do ahead of time or during a drought? What changes can you make to reduce your vulnerability and to respond to drought when it does happen? I will say that the scale of drought planning makes a difference. If you look at the Earth as a whole, from like a NASA blue marble photo, we're mostly water. And what could the problem be? It's all flowing and moving around. But in fact, we know that there are geopolitical boundaries, country boundaries, state boundaries, and then there are also these natural boundaries like river basins that all affect the availability of water. Then you get down to this kind of landscape scale where people are making decisions to balance water for agriculture and for cities and for fish and wildlife. And that's kind of where it gets pretty real, and or at a different level, different kinds of decisions and options than you find at a state or national level. And then by the time you're down at a city level where there's maybe just one or two water towers, it's really just all about keeping the water flowing and protecting your source supply. So there are different decisions that can be made at each scale of planning and different levels of responsibility and expectation, depending on who's doing the planning. So the Drought Center has resources for individuals, especially ranchers. We've partnered with the American Planning Association to do some guidelines on planning and drought and on cascading hazards. We also created drought-ready communities. That's like a planning process for a small community to go through. We have drought planning guidance for states, countries, tribes, sovereign nations. And we have worked with river basin organizations and countries around the world. One of our most interesting and probably best utilized set of resources is for ranchers. It's called Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch. It's got its own website, ranchdrought.unl.edu. It's got its own monitoring section, its own planning section, a lot of different ideas for different resources that are available, and also a way to kind of come up to speed, drought basics, teaching you about the basics of drought. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how can you know that you're in a drought. Our website includes a pretty good collection of drought monitoring tools. There are a lot of different ways to measure drought. The basic definition is when you don't get as much precipitation or as much water as you need. That can mean precipitation. It can mean soil moisture. We can be talking about reservoir levels. We can be talking about things that are a little more abstract, like crop loss. I mean, that's not abstract, but it's a little bit more removed from the actual original driver of a lack of precipitation. So our website includes many different ways to monitor drought, and we normally recommend that people understand the big picture on drought monitoring, like the US Drought Monitor or one of these other large area maps, but then also know what you're monitoring locally. Like, is there a particular stream gauge or reservoir level that's most relevant for your circumstances? And of course, a lot of ranchers and farmers have their own rain gauges and their own soil moisture probes, and they know exactly what they're doing. But it's a really good idea to kind of get a sense of how your local measurements relate to that bigger picture. So if you're looking at both frequently, that's valuable information to have. This is climatology, not even 101, climatology 99. Climatologists do everything in relative to 30-year averages. So these charts are what's called a climograph. On the left is Lincoln, Nebraska, where you get average annual precipitation of 29 inches. And on the right is Scottsbluff, where you get average annual precipitation of 16 inches. The green bars show you the average monthly precipitation, and the red is the average temperature. And the reason I'm showing you this is because drought is always depends on what's normal for a certain a particular location. So what would be a normal precipitation year in Scotts Bluff would be a pretty bad drought in Lincoln. This is the US Drought Monitor map that our organization helps produce. We're the academic partner and the web host of the US Drought Monitor map. This is the drought monitor that came out this past Thursday. They come out every Thursday morning, and you can see Lincoln is in a little bit of drought. The first level of drought, moderate drought, that kind of light beige color. Another product that we make is called agricultural commodities in drought, where we're overlaying crop production areas with the drought monitor map. And this is a current one. It's also from last Thursday's data. It shows the area that's in drought, and it compares it with corn production areas. So you can see that a portion of Nebraska's corn production is affected by drought. Another monitoring tool that we have is called GrassCast. This is of interest to a lot of ranchers. The map on the left shows what would happen if we had above normal precipitation from where we are now in the growing season through the end of August. The one in the middle shows what would happen if we have normal precipitation between now and the end of growing season. And the one on the right shows what would happen if we have below normal precipitation. So you can see that the high plains, the Panhandle area, the southern part of this area has been pretty wet this year. So whatever happens, they're going to have fairly good yield. But some of the northern areas might be a little bit more vulnerable if they have not had as much rain so far this season. GrassCast is a pretty interesting tool. Okay, now we're going to talk about drought impacts, which helps us answer the question, what do you need to protect from drought in your location, and what do you want to prevent? We have something called the Drought Impacts Toolkit at droughtimpacts.unl.edu. It includes the Drought Impact Reporter, which has near real-time impacts that have been curated from media since 2005 and added to this big database. We've got this crowdsourcing system called Condition Monitoring Observer Reports, or CMOR for short. We say that it helps us see more drought. And we've also got some kind of experimental media monitoring from news media and social media, as well as a collection of post-drought assessments and other ways to detect emerging drought. This is what's in the Drought Impact Reporter for Nebraska from July 2015 to July to this month. There are 180 impacts logged for the state as a whole, over 1,000 logged for different counties, and 83 for different cities. And the time series chart shows you that for all the different levels, all different scales of impact, 2012 and 13 were pretty dramatic years, and a lot of us probably remember those years. And more recently, 2022 and 23 were pretty bad drought years. We break impacts down by category. So there, green is agriculture, blue is water supply, red is fire, light green is the environment, and so on. And it's a pretty typical pattern to see that water impacts and also this orange category for restrictions are the ones that dominate most at the city level, because watering restrictions are some of the most frequently imposed effects of drought in a city, excuse me. Whereas at the state level, people are talking more about agriculture, the dark green ones. So some quick examples of Nebraska impacts in the drought impact report are just from the past 30 days. One has to do with below normal river navigation in the Missouri River, because there's not enough water to support bigger, deeper barges. Another is below normal hydropower production in the Missouri River. There was a fireworks ban in Ogallala, and wheat has been affected by wheat streak mosaic virus in Kansas and neighboring states. So right now, as we saw on the map earlier, not real bad drought in Nebraska, but we do still have some very recent impacts recorded. And I'm going to also give you a little overview of the Seymour system, the condition monitoring observer reports that I mentioned. This is an Esri-based system. We're using a lot of off-the-shelf technologies so that people can take a picture on their phone and upload it immediately into the system, and their dot appears on the map right away if they choose to upload it from the field. If this is anything that anyone is interested in, I'm happy to make an additional presentation. We can talk about it more at the end of this session if there's time. Otherwise, I'm happy to schedule an additional session, or you can go to this QR code or this address at the bottom, go.unl.edu/Seymour_drought, and look at the resources there. It's actually pretty easy to get started. Some people may be able to do it immediately. There's no sign up, no training process. If people would like to share information about how drought is affecting them, this is a system that is available for everyone. This is what Seymour looks like for year to date for Nebraska. These are reports across the state. Every dot on the map is where somebody has uploaded an observation. The color of the dot reflects how dry or wet they said that it is. And I pulled out examples of some of the photos that people have uploaded. This one's from Kimball County on July 9th. They said it was severely dry, and they're talking here about pasture conditions. I believe this one from Webster County on the 15th was crop conditions, possibly pasture. And they're reporting moderately dry conditions. And I believe the one from Thayer County back in June, I think they were talking about a dry pond. I think this is supposed to be a pond or a reservoir. So that gives you just a very quick idea of some of the kinds of things that people are uploading into the Seymour system. And that is my presentation for now. Any questions? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelly. If anybody has any questions about Kelly's portion, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can answer those. I don't see anything, so if nobody has any questions, then we will move on to Ben's portion. I think we're okay to move on, Ben, if you're ready to go.
All righty. And I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I'm at home with a toddler with hand, foot, and mouth. So if you see a Mr. Potato Head or some weird snacks or weird sounds go across the screen, my apologies. My name is Ben Beckman. I work with Nebraska Extension. I'm a county-based extension agent. I'm up in Cedar County, and I work with livestock producers primarily. So we're going to focus a little bit today on the impacts of drought, looking at it primarily through a livestock side of things. I do a lot of work with pasture range management, and so we're going to really dive into what I see, I guess, my perspective on it from that angle. And I really appreciate Kelly setting the stage, especially when she was talking about drought's different depending on where you are in the state. And so drought for us in Cedar County is different than people down in southeast Nebraska, is different for people out in the Panhandle. And we're going to talk about how some of those differences have impacted our pastures, our native plants, some of those things, and how they deal with drought. But especially for us as land managers, knowing what we have naturally to deal with is really helpful and impactful when we're talking about drought management. I will also throw in a plug. Kelly put up a lot of really great resources. We use a lot of those in the extension world. A lot of the satellite-based vegetative indices are really great tools if you have native rangeland or you're in an area with native rangeland. You noticed on that grass cast that it kind of cut off the eastern side of the state. It's just blank. And so those work really good on native pasture. If you've got brome pasture or you're in an area where it's really crop dominated and you're still doing some grazing, those tools do not have really good, readings in that area. And so they just usually don't even report. And so that's just something we can have. Some of those tools are really great. Unfortunately, for some of us on the eastern side of the state, there are things that we can't always use and rely upon. So just to dive in a little bit here today, we're going to talk about three different things. We're going to really dive into effects of drought on pasture rangeland. What does that mean from a grazing perspective? What does that mean from a cattle perspective, primarily here in Nebraska? And then what can we do about it? So we know that we've got drought. We know that it has impact on our animals. How do we manage and deal for that, especially if we can do some things management-wise ahead of time? So exactly kind of what Kelly shared. We've got drought in the state. Nebraska is a plain state. We're dealing with drought pretty constantly. Severity of drought differs year to year, differs location-wise. Sometimes we're fortunate enough to have abundant rainfall here in Nebraska, and a neighboring state has drought issues, and that impacts us still from the availability of having some of our forage resources, hay prices, things like that, how our cattle prices and cattle market goes. All of these things still impact us here in Nebraska, even if we're not dealing with the drought directly. And as was mentioned before too, we've got a big gradient. When you look at really the difference in Nebraska, we go from all the way to plus 30 inches of precipitation annually in the southeastern part of the state, all the way to under 16, usually in that 14 to 12 inch range when we get out into the panhandle. And so that's affected how our native grasses have grown, and that affects what drought looks like a lot of times, and how our pastures are going to react to that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit here. Especially when you look at the historical types of prairie in Nebraska. I know this is a little bit fuzzy. Stole this from the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, but our short grass prairie out in the Panhandle and the very far western part of the state is used to dry conditions, and so we don't see as much production out in that neck of the woods as we would have in the tall grass prairie. There's a reason that the tall grass prairie all got converted to crop ground, because it's really highly productive parts of the state. And so what the impacts of drought are and how those plants deal with it is really going to vary depending on where we're at in the state. So besides where we are in the state, what the plant is and how that plant functions ecologically and physiologically really matters as well. Different plants have different root systems. If we're talking about grasses, a lot of times they have a fibrous root system, but it's kind of shallow. They've got some that go really deep, but they're not really as deep rooted as, say, a shrub would be, or even some of our prairie forbs. They can have really, really long root systems. And so that really plays a difference in how drought is going to impact that. And if we've got, long-term drought versus a short, hot, dry spell. Cool season to warm season grasses, C3 to C4. C3 grasses are a little less efficient from a water standpoint. C4 grasses have some evolutionary things that make them more efficient from a water standpoint. And so they deal with warmer conditions a lot better than our cool season grasses. And so we can see that in where they, grow typically in the growing season, what temperatures they prefer, but also how they react to drought. And then also there's going to be some impacts from the life cycle of the plant. An annual is going to react differently than a biennial or a perennial, just because its primary goal is to produce seed. It doesn't need to survive next year. And so it might quicken up a life cycle and just produce seed really fast if conditions go dry, versus the perennial is going to try to pull some of those resources down where it can. Speaking of that, I always like to make this plug a little bit. A lot of our understanding of drought and impacts of drought, especially in prairie grasses and stuff, go to a professor at the University of Lincoln, J.E. Weaver. John Edgar Weaver did a lot of work, and if you ever want to look at some really cool things, he'd go out and make these really neat monoliths where he'd go and look at different grazing intensities and see what impact that had on root development in some of our prairie species. And he was working during the 1930s, and so he was able to really firsthand describe and document some of the impacts of the Dust Bowl and some of those really dry conditions on our prairie species here in Nebraska and some of the droughts. And so he would go out and he'd dig these giant trenches, and he just map the roots in some of these cases. And so we've got really beautiful hand-drawn drawings that he would go out, and you can see in some of these cases, again, the root system really matters. We've got our grasses that some of these short grass species going down up to 5 feet for some of those more fibrous root systems. And then you've got those prairie forbs there, some of those stretching all the way down to 11 feet down into the soil. So as I mentioned before, knowing what our plants are in our pasture is really important when we come to managing drought and what that looks like. Plants are going to respond differently to drought in different circumstances and depending on what they are. Some plants, like I said, a lot of our annual plants are just going to mature early. They're going to have a deficit in precipitation, and they're going to say, oh, I just need to produce seed. So they're going to be stunted in growth. We can see this in some of our perennial plants sometimes, but a lot of times in our annual species, this is the route that they'll take. And perennial species or some of our biennial species, they say, okay, we can't keep functioning. And so they're going to reallocate some of those energy that they have, pull it out of the top of the plant and reallocate it to the roots so they can make it through that drought period. And they're going to actually go into dormancy if we get into a severe enough drought. So we're saying, 2012 was a really dry period during a critical growing season for a big chunk of the state. And so we saw a lot of our, especially cool season species, but even some of our warm season species that year went into dormancy because drought was just so severe. Those plants could not keep functioning. There wasn't enough water for photosynthesis to keep occurring. And so they went into full dormancy. And that can impact how we manage them then. If we have pastures that have gone into full dormancy, we still want to leave some stubble and some cover behind, but it's not going to be quite as impactful. Excuse me there. It's not going to be quite as impactful from a management standpoint if we do a little bit harder grazing on them when we've got full plants in full dormancy versus if they're growing up, still continuing to grow. It's not as stressful on them. So like I said, early maturing, this is a picture that I took. I was doing some research in the sandhills in 2012. And so we had some really stunted plants. I mean, this is a sand blue stem plant that a lot of times can get up to chest high on me. So, 4 or 5 feet tall, 4 feet tall. And we had some that were barely 2 feet tall and were already maturing out and producing seed heads. Um, once we understand what those plants are going to do, then we can start to understand, okay, what's the whole system response and how can we plan about that? So typically what we see following a drought is we've got some decreased vigor in our perennial plant species. This is a stressor on them. It set them back somewhat, and so they're going to have to recover from that. Those plants expended a lot of energy just to stay alive, and so their growth the next year is going to be impacted. If we graze them really hard while they were in the process of going into dormancy or coming out of dormancy, that's going to impact it even more, and we're going to have even worse results. And so drought response, a lot of times we go, oh, we got rain, we're all set. If we push the system a little bit too hard during drought, we might have impacts for 5 years, longer than 5 years on our productivity until those plants in that system, gets back to where it was previously. And so those are just things, especially when we're managing pasture, are really important to keep in mind. Because of that decreased vigor, a lot of times the canopy opens up then because these plants aren't growing as big as they normally do. So they're a little bit smaller in size. We've got more sunlight that penetrates to the ground, and nature abhors a vacuum. And so what do we get? We get this boom of annual plant species. And so when we've got a drought, the following year, it's not uncommon to see, you go around the sandhills and all of a sudden we've got sunflowers everywhere, or, snow on the mountain, or some of these species that we consider weedy species, they're just filling in a vacuum. There's openings there. They're going to establish themselves. A lot of times with proper grazing management, we get those keystone species back to where they should be, and they're going to go, get out competed and go away. If we get invasion of some more serious species, maybe we've got Canada thistle that decided to come in, or leafy spurge or something like that, then we need to do a little bit more management wise and might need to pay a little bit more attention. But if we've just got that bloom of annual species, it looks bad. Sometimes people want to go out and do some spraying. A lot of times we can just graze through that and manage through it without having to spend those extra resources. You know, again, knowing what's in your pastures, knowing what species you're dealing with is really critical and really important. This is a key example. This isn't necessarily a drought, but this is along a roadside. We've got a gate here, high impact area, a lot of disturbance. So perennial species are not predominant here. They're not growing very well. What do we get? We get a flush of annual species because it's just filling in that vacuum. Like I said, long term, we have to deal with a couple of different scenarios. If we're managing correctly, maybe we're going to have full recovery. It might take a little bit while, a little time, but we can get there if we watch how we're doing our grazing management, and if we get some precipitation and things fall into line. If we get some really invasive plant species, we might have, like here, we've got a nice flush of leafy spurge, all that yellow in that pasture there. Those plants are extremely invasive anyways. We weakened our pasture system by drought, and we just gave them another leg up here. Because of that, they're going to recover from that drought fairly quickly because they're very strong, invasive species, a lot of seed production. And so we might have to do some management from that side. And then we can see if we really push the system too hard, maybe we're continue grazing really hard during the drought period, and we don't do any management shifts, don't provide for any recovery period, we can have an entire shift of a species and move something towards lower quality grasses, grasses that are better able to handle drought and grazing pressure, which are usually not the grasses that our cattle are going to want to eat. And so, if we push things too hard, we can have some problematic shifts to the system. And so in the short term, just to kind of lay this out, we can have some reduced capacity in the short term. But again, we've already stressed those plants, so we have an increased risk of overgrazing because of that. From the long-term side of things, hopefully we can do some recovery. We can get, our pastures back to where they need to be, and then we can just continue managing like we normally do. But if we continue that stress, maybe we continue to have a lack of precipitation, or we're grazing over hard. We are going to definitely go into that overgrazing category, and we're going to lose capacity, and we're actually going to start overstocking and then overgraze worse, and it kind of becomes a vicious cycle. So it's something that we need to just keep in mind as we do our management. Just a couple other considerations whenever we're dealing with drought. Water's always a big thing from a livestock standpoint. So usually we've got fairly good livestock wells, but if you're dealing with any surface water as your main water source, especially ponds, having those dry up or become shrinking to the point that we've got water quality concerns, are something that we need to keep an eye on from a livestock standpoint. And then when pasture's short, people are going to pull off and they're going to start feeding animals. So hay production is going to be reduced, and hay is being taken up. And so feed costs are always going to be higher usually during a drought. And so we've got to figure out, okay, how do we manage through that? How's that going to impact our bottom line? Do we need to do some culling? Do we need to, hopefully we've got enough hay in the hay yard that we're able to feed through it. Some of those more serious decisions need to come up. So when we know that we've got drought, we know that we're in a climate here, we're in the high plains and the Great Plains where we have frequent drought. Managing around it's really important. I always advocate for more flexibility, and the system is going to be better. So if we can have a grazing system that we've got some rest built into it, so maybe we have a deferred system and we've got some already have a pasture that's sitting vacant once a year, and that's just our area that if we do need to have some overflow and we need to do some grazing, we can go into that pasture. That's what some people do. Maybe it's having just a diversity of animals on our operation. So we've got our cow-calf pairs, but we also have some stockers that we bring in annually. And this year we've got a really dry year coming up. We're not going to bring those stockers in anymore. So there's some flexibility there from the livestock class side of things. Diversity within our pasture system, having cool season and warm season pastures and plants in our system. They're growing at different times. They're needing moisture at key points in times in the season. And so maybe we have a drought that's like this year, we had some pretty dry conditions early, and then we've gotten some moisture, later on in the growing season that impacted a lot of our cool season plants. We had some shorter brome pastures this year, didn't impact the warm seasons quite as badly because it wasn't during their key growing period. So some diversity within our system that way. And then, we have things like annual forages that we can fill in, and do some planting and produce some additional forage. So thinking through these options, what works for your system. And then I always advocate too, I didn't throw this on here. If you're doing any sort of rental agreement, whether you're the landowner or the leasee, having some sort of drought clause or disaster clause that walks through what happens if we've got drought and how that is going to be decided, and when cattle need to be pulled off of a pasture, who's making that decision, how long notice is given, all of those things laid out ahead of time. So we're not having to make those decisions and understand how all that happens in the heat of the moment. Just so everyone's aware, makes things, it's a difficult time anyways. If we all know what to expect, it makes it a little bit easier. And then the last thing I'm always going to put a plug in for is monitoring. So knowing what's natural, what's normal for your area, and whether that's taking a photo point from a certain place every year at a certain time. Maybe it's going out and visually describing the top 3 species. Maybe it's taking some plant height measurements, whatever works for your operation and system, being able to compare year to year so you can make some decisions objectively. Because as humans, I can't remember what I had for lunch last week. So how I'm expected to remember something that happened last year. It's really a blessing that I can remember my kids' birthdays sometimes. And so, having a monitoring system in place so we can objectively look at things and make decisions is really important. So with that, always happy to field any questions. I've got my email put up there. I'm happy to take phone calls as well. Yeah, hopefully that kind of gives a really broad perspective when we're thinking about drought impacts and management in Nebraska.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and launch that survey. So if everybody in attendance could go ahead and take that, and then if there's any questions, please put them into the chat or the Q&A section. I know, Ben, you were talking about making sure that you have like agreements if you're renting out the land. Is that something that the extension office would like help farmers like kind of try and figure out like what they should include as the clause in that?
It's definitely something that we can help with. We do have a report, the CAP program, so the Center for Ag Profitability, releases a rental rates report every year. So we always, that's one of the first questions: what should I charge for rent? So we're happy to help on that side of things, and then we can help walk through. Every lease is going to be different. It needs to fit your specific circumstances. But yeah, if you get a hold of your local extension office, or like I said, you can reach out to me. I'm happy to chat as well. We can walk through some of those things and some considerations. I'll also put a plug in: beef.unl.edu is our extension livestock page. It's beef. We're in the beef state in Nebraska, but all sorts of livestock information there. So we've got some on drought management and pasture leases. And then if you're looking for some templates, aglease101.org. It's a consortium put together by, I believe, some of the risk management agency funding, that a bunch of land grant institutions have compiled a bunch of resources on ag leases. And so they've got some example leases. They've got some really great resources there as well.
Okay, yeah. And I am gonna send a follow-up email next week or so that I can include those links in there too. So if anybody wants those, then we can include those in there. And I can include Ben's contact information and Kelly's contact information as well. So there's a question that says, bird spread marijuana and cedar trees. How can landowners battle these invasive weeds?
I'm guessing that's directed at me more than you, Kelly. So the key, I guess, to dealing with invasive species or species that we don't want in our pastures is having good grazing management first and foremost. So if we've got a healthy system, we've got really strong plants that we want to be there. It's going to be a lot harder for these species to invade. Especially with our hemp species. That's an annual plant, and so it needs a disturbance to come in and to really get a good foothold. That's where you see it really pop up in places. And so if we've got a big problem with it spread across the pasture, that's probably, we need to address some grazing practices first and foremost. If it's within a small area, then maybe it's just around the water tank. And so sometimes there's just those sacrifice areas that are going to be have a little bit more disturbance to them, and we're going to have to just kind of do some general management, whether that's mowing or whatever through it, and just recognize that it's kind of confined to an area. From a cedar tree standpoint, cedars are becoming a bigger and bigger issue across the state. Woody plant invasion in general is, and so staying on top of that and really protecting, if we've got open pasture, going out and cutting young cedars. If we've got the opportunity, there's a lot of burn associations that have been popping up all over the state. I know the Game and Parks Association, NRCS has a lot of resources. Extension does as well. And so, trying to maintain the core open grasslands and then kind of keeping that encroachment out from there is really kind of the way that we are starting to look at cedar tree encroachment. I think they call it defend the core is kind of the management principle that they talk about with that. And so it's really we've kind of narrowed down that cedar trees are typically going to be propagated within like 95% or within 100 yards of the seed source. And so if we know that we've got a shelter belt, we need to be managing really intensively within 100 yards of that shelter belt, because that's where our new seedlings are going to come in. But if we get, a new plant that's mature 100 yards out, now we've got, another 100 yards that we have to manage for. And it keeps, going as soon as we get more and more mature trees and seed sources. So getting those seed sources under control and then managing those areas where we know high risk is really important.
All right, well, thank you. I don't see any more questions or anything. So thank you, Ben and Kelly, for putting this on for us. We really appreciate you taking your time out to do this for us. All right, have a great night.